Hello and welcome back to the Maastricht Migration Lecture Series. If you're new to us, we're very happy to have you here. My name is Melissa Siegel. I'm a professor of migration studies at the Maastricht Graduate School of Governance and United Nations University Merit, and I will be your host and moderator today. So the purpose of these lecture series is to bring information about migration to the general public and also especially to the public in Maastricht. This is a series that is jointly hosted by the Refugee Project Maastricht, the Maastricht Young Academy, the Maastricht Center for Citizenship, Migration and Development, the UN Student Association, and UNU Merit. And the idea of this, again, is just to bring knowledge about migration across a variety of areas to the general public. Now, today we're very happy to have a very special guest with us, Professor Mark Levels. And he's going to be talking to us today about looking at a cross-national comparative perspective on research on racial and ethnic disparities, really zooming in on the situation of children in primary and secondary education and understanding these differences. Mark is a professor of health education and work at Maastricht University, and he is the program director for the research program Health, Skills and Inequality at the Research Center for Education and Labor Market here at Maastricht University. He's been working on issues of integration, labor market and education, as well as others for very many years now, and is really an expert on this topic. So we're extremely happy to have him with us today. The way this is going to work is that Professor Levels will first give a talk of around 40 minutes, and then we will also open up the rest of the time to questions. Of course, you can actually ask questions at any time. Please just go ahead and put those in the YouTube chat, and we'll be monitoring them, and I'll make sure to get your questions to Professor Levels when he finishes with his opening remarks. With that being said, I think we will just get right into it. So, Mark, the floor is yours. Thank you again for being here with us.
Thank you, Melissa, and I'm very happy that you would have me. Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be able to share my work with this audience. I want to ask your forgiveness, all of you, in advance. This is for me a little bit of an experiment. It's the first time that I do a lecture like this in a setting like this. I've been working from home since March, as I think many of us have, but we made the crucial mistake of buying a small puppy. That was very sweet until just half an hour ago, and now it's trying to take over my house and start eating my furniture. So you might experience some background noises every once in a while. I'll try to ignore it and finish my talk, and I would invite you to ignore them as well. I'm Mark Levels indeed, and I want to talk to you about cross-nationally comparative research on racial and ethnic skill disparities. Let's see if I can get this PowerPoint to work. Yes, so the theme of this lecture is basically the way in which research developed on skills of children in primary and secondary education between 2000 and 2017. And I'm focusing on three types of skills: math, reading, and scientific skills. And I'm using evidence from direct skills assessments, large-scale surveys like TIMSS, PISA, PIRLS, and PISA. I will explain what they are for you in a second. Now, initially, I thought it would be nice to also talk a little bit about attitudes of children in primary and secondary education. But for reasons of time, I decided to strike that. Maybe I want to share with you also, this is for me a very personal talk, and has been a very personal journey. This whole research line, my whole research line on the skills of immigrant children using these type of data started with my master's studies, with my master's thesis in 2006. It's published in 2008, and it ended with the publication of the Palgrave Handbook of Race and Ethnic Inequalities, where we performed a systematic review of the entire line of literature. And this is also the paper that I want to discuss with you today. So what I want to do is I want to discuss the findings of this systematic review that use large-scale assessment data for studying immigrant children and the children of immigrants' educational performance. I want to walk you through the evolution of research questions that have been addressed with such data, and discuss the findings with you, more specifically the relevance of schools, relevance of individual characteristics, and the relevance of origin and destination country differences for explaining these achievement differences. And I also want to discuss with you some of the strengths and weaknesses of this line of research. Specifically, I think this topic and also this studying this topic lends itself for a more meta narrative about the role of social sciences in society. So what I also want to do is place this entire literature with you in a somewhat wider societal context and discuss some of the implications, and maybe also critically assess how the findings of this whole research line are used in the public and in the political sphere, how they influence debates, and whether or not we think that is useful or not is maybe up for discussion later. But this is what I want to do with you today. And maybe first, let's think a little bit about why this is important. I think we all can agree that education is a silver bullet, is often seen as a silver bullet for successful participation in society, for native children, but also certainly also for immigrant children. This type of research focuses specifically on the skills that we deem necessary for full and valuable participation on the labor market of tomorrow. Reading skills are seen as essential. Writing skills are seen as essential. Math, increasingly important. So by focusing on these skills and also the way in which we do this in this research line, and I will get back to how we do it later, we're trying to investigate the core of immigrant future integration in Western societies. And we use direct assessments of skills because that enables us to better compare between groups and countries. And for example, educational attainment levels that we usually use, that we also use. These systems differ between countries, and the extent to which a higher degree, for example, gives you access to the labor market also differs between countries. And they're also better than self-reported tests because we know that people are generally not very well able to assess their own ability on math. So the idea is here that we try to study immigrant children's participation, immigrant children's achievement on math and reading tests, direct tests, and that will enable us to better compare groups and countries than research on attainment or self-reported tests would do. And as I said, I mostly use material from this specific paper that we published last year in the Paul Grave Handbook of Race and Ethnic Inequalities, together with Alexander Dix and the late Jaap Dronkers. Okay. Maybe to start, for those of you who are not familiar with this type of research on skills, what are we talking about when we talk about direct assessment of skills? There are a number of large cross-national surveys that are designed to study directly how well people are able to read or do math or do calculus and so forth. One of those is the PIRLS study, the Progress in International Reading Literacy study, that's held every 5 years in about 40 countries, and it tests pupils in 4th grade, and it assesses their reading literacy. And how does it do it? There is a main survey, and that consists of a written comprehension reading test, and there is a background questionnaire. And from this reading comprehension test, I'll give you some examples from PISA in a second. We can then infer how well pupils in 4th grade are able to read these different countries. And as you can see here on this map, there is some large cross-national differences in the extent to which 4th graders are able to read. This will be important later. TIMSS is the Trends in International Mathematics and Science study. It's also held every 4 years, but now with people in 4th and 8th grade. And this focuses, the name kind of gives it away, right, on mathematics and science domains, algebra, geometry, biology, and so forth. And it also assesses the extent to which pupils in 4th and 8th grade are able to solve problems in these specific domains. It's also a very large study. About 40 to 55 countries participate. Now, you might have not heard about TIMSS or PIRLS, but you probably heard about PISA, because this is, I think, by far the most famous type of study. PISA is the Program for International Student Assessment from the OECD. And this is designed, and I will revisit this idea also later, to evaluate education systems worldwide by testing the skills and knowledge of 50-year-old students in a similar way. It's held every 3 years from 2000 onwards. When they started, there were about 43 countries participated. Right now, it's about 70 countries that participate in PISA. And these students are assessed on science literacy, on mathematical literacy, on their reading skills, and there are also modules on collaborative problem solving and financial literacy. And mind you, these are all psychometric constructs that are measured in a very elaborate way. And the ambition is then to measure them in a way that they are cross-nationally and cross-culturally comparable. How are they measured? Well, the variables are latent constructs that are measured through various multiple items, and the items are designed to directly test the extent to which students can actually are actually proficient in these skills. It's a bit of a large survey, so pupils are not presented with all the items in the questionnaire, but with a selection of those, and then item response modeling techniques are used to calculate plausible values on literacy. It's a technical story, but what you should get from this is that these plausible values together provide an unbiased estimate of the answer of all the literacy question on all the literacy items, and thereby an unbiased estimate of the latent construct. And that could be mathematical literacy or reading ability or science proficiency. And then they're also gather information on background characteristics and on schools. Maybe to give you an idea about how this works, an example from the PISA, 2 examples from the PISA questionnaire. So the idea is not that to assess how well students know the Pythagorean theorem, for example, but the extent to which they are able to use it in very real-life situations. So, for example, they would present it with a picture like here on the left, and then the question could be calculate the area of the attic floor ABCD. Calculate the length of line EF, one on the horizontal edge of the block, and then the students have to do the math and give the correct answer. And an answer can be correct or incorrect, and from that and from a number of these questions, it can then be inferred how well they are at math. Different question here about growth of youth, and you can see here a question: since 1980, the average height of a 20-year-old female has increased by 2.3 centimeters to 170.6. What was the average height of a 20-year-old female in 1980, and so forth. So you can see maybe how PISA is trying to assess the mathematical literacy of students. They're all 15-year-olds. Now, why is this helpful? The idea is that this equation on the right here is the same in every country. So the way that this test is constructed, it is designed to be cross-nationally and cross-culturally equivalent, so that people from different cultures and different backgrounds can actually use it in the same way, and that will foster comparisons. It's also helpful because the OECD and also the organizers of PIRLS and TIMSS are measuring actual skills that we all think are required for successful participation. And by setting up these large-scale data sets in similar ways in different countries, we can get closer to finding out whether or not some observations that we do in single countries can be generalized. And this also enables us to test explanations that we couldn't test before. Just maybe a quick example about the generalizability. We know from country case studies that immigrant children from Southeast Asia perform very well at math. Specifically, these studies come from the US. Well, that begs the question, is this also the case in other countries? Is this also the case in Germany or in the Netherlands? Is this something that is very typical to immigrant children from Southeast Asia? Or is it very typical for immigrant children from Southeast Asia in the US? Now, the only way to answer this question is by doing large-scale cross-national research. And we have done this and shown, indeed, that this observation can be generalized to other countries as well. But this large cross-national setup also allows us to test explanations for differences that we could not really test without these types of data. So, for example, we know that there is large cross-national variation in the extent to which young Turks perform in school. They perform differently in different countries. Now, if you want to understand what's happening here, you might hypothesize that the education system or a wider context of reception is elementary in explaining this. But in order to test that hypothesis, you would want to compare as many contexts of reception as possible. And that means a large cross-national data set. So now we have these data. Maybe a good example here, this is a table from my own work, and it's also presented in this systematic review based on PISA 2003. What you're looking at is average reading literacy of immigrant pupils for a number of destination countries in the West from a number of origin countries. And what I want you to see here, what I want you to focus on here is the bottom three rows. What you can see is that immigrants on average perform less well than natives. That holds in all countries, but there are arguably large cross-national differences, right? So in some countries, this gap is wider than in others. And there's more to learn from this table. If you focus, for example, on one country, this is Austria, you can see here that immigrant children from various destination countries perform differently. So children from Hungary perform very well, 500 is the average, whereas children from Romania perform below average. What we can also learn is that there are destination country differences indeed. If we keep on looking at children from Romania, you see that they are much better, they perform much better in Ireland, for example. So you can get from this simple table, just with simple cross-tabulation, that there are differences, relevant differences in performance between immigrant children from different origin countries, and also relevant differences between children within between different destination countries. And this is variance that we can explain, and that researchers have been trying to explain for 20 years now. And this whole field evolved in 4 waves. I'm going to walk you through them briefly. So the first wave focused mostly on the immigrant children's individual level background characteristics and tried to figure out whether or not they play a different role in different destination countries. I will explain if they do so and how in a second. The second wave of research focused more on school level characteristics and tried to figure out if the schools contribute to immigrant children's educational performance, and if so, how that then works. The third wave of questions focused specifically on the explanations on the level of destination countries, and the fourth wave focused on the origin country traits. So what did we learn from all this? The literature on the individual level background characteristics shows something that we basically already knew, but now shows that this is the case in many countries. So socioeconomic, sociocultural, and also school characteristics explain most of the educational achievement differences between immigrant pupils and natives. And there are large cross-national differences that then need to be explained. It also shows that there are assimilation, or if you will, integration effects. So first generation immigrant children are less mathematical literate than second generation immigrant children, and they in turn are less mathematically literate than native children. And both of these findings can be then explained by the influence of time. So the longer immigrants stay in a country of destination, the better they perform at school. This is all very much in line with standard assimilation theory, and also something that you would expect to see. So this is the first wave. There are, however, large cross-national differences. So in the US, socioeconomic background almost completely explains the immigrant native achievement gap, whereas in many European countries explains Austria, France, Germany, Luxembourg, it explains about half of it. And in Belgium, Denmark, Greece, and the Netherlands, Norway, and Switzerland, it explains only part of it, but not a lot. And then we also know that, and this is also the case for time of stay, or generation status, or for language proficiency in your second language. There are cross-national differences in the extent to which these variables affect educational performance. But this first wave of research could not really explain this well. The second wave focused on school characteristics and tried to figure out if the explanation for these differences might be caused or might be explained by school characteristics. And there are a lot of different characteristics tested. The most prominent explanation focused on the the proportion of immigrant children in schools, the famous black and white school discussion. And here you also see that the immigrant proportion in schools contributes to explaining the achievement of immigrant pupils, but also that there are large cross-national differences. In Australia and in Canada, higher immigrant proportions in school increase the achievement of immigrant pupils. Whereas in the Netherlands, Sweden, the UK, and the US, the immigrant share does not seem to be important. And in Switzerland, Germany, New Zealand, and France, this immigrant share actually reduces or is negatively related to the achievement of immigrant pupils. And what I really do want you to remember from this is that this is found with consistent finding, but that on average, the effects of ethnic segregation are small compared to the effects of the socioeconomic makeup of the schools. So there are compositional differences that contribute to explaining performance of immigrant children in schools. Ethnic composition of the student body, but also the socioeconomic background composition of the student body play a role. And of those, the second seems to be much more important than the first. And then there are other things that people have looked at, like the pupil-teacher ratio and the average achievement of peers. And I think the general consensus is that these do affect immigrant children's achievement, but only in a very small way. So schools matter, but mostly the composition of schools seem to matter. The third wave of research focused on destination country differences. And here also a lot of different types of explanations have been tested related to education systems, to anti-discrimination legislation, welfare arrangements, the political climate, economic development, the openness to receiving, societal openness to receiving immigrants, but also the labor market, immigration regulation, ethnic diversity, you name it. It's been tested in these types of analyses. What we've learned is that countries with larger immigrant communities tend to have smaller gaps in performance between immigrants and natives. We also learned that the education system matters. So non-comprehensive school systems seem to increase, and this is a pretty robust finding, seem to increase the inequality between immigrant and native students. And we think that can be explained because there are fewer peer interactions in such systems between high and low ability students, and that immigrant students are affected by that. Another interesting finding is that early tracking it disadvantages children from disadvantaged backgrounds, but it also substantially disadvantages immigrant children who do not speak the national language at home. And we know that systems that allow for grade retention also in these systems, that immigrant children are more likely to repeat a grade, and that therefore the immigrant native achievement gap is larger. So education system matters, but that's not the only thing that's been investigated. People also, I did this myself as well. People also look at immigration laws and the consequences of those. We find that in these traditional immigration countries, Canada and the US, immigrant children are often much less disadvantaged than in continental Europe. And this is, of course, probably explained by the selective migration policies of these countries. The reasoning here being that if an immigration policy is more selective and it selects based on parents' human capital, parental skills are very highly positively correlated with children's skills. So then you would also see that on average, the skills of the immigrant children would be higher in countries that select based on their parents' skills. Here's a somewhat controversial finding that that in countries with social democratic welfare regimes, immigrants, first generation immigrant students appear to fare worse and do worse than in liberal welfare regimes, but that for second generation immigrant students, the social democratic welfare regimes are more beneficial. This is one paper that finds that, and this might also be a spurious relation, because if you control for other characteristics and for compositional differences, this difference seems to disappear. And you might notice that I try and I choose my wording carefully, and that is related to the weaknesses of these types of designs that I will revisit in a second. But not before I discuss with you the relevance of origin countries. So the fourth wave of research answers the question, what is the relationship between origin country traits and immigrant children's performance on assessment tests? And you saw on the table that there are differences between origin countries, so that is some variation that screams to be explained. That has been done. I've been involved also in this research. And we find that origin effects indeed do play a role in predicting educational performance of immigrants, controlling for destination country differences, controlling for individual level differences. So for example, what this research shows is that if you are an immigrant child or a child of an immigrant and you come from a country that is economically less developed, that surprisingly, children from these types of backgrounds perform rather well, holding constant for everything else. And the same is true for children who come from origin countries that are politically stable. We also find that the education system of the origin country is related to the performance of children while they are in their destination country. Well, this gives a very broad overview of the findings of this literature, of this type of literature. And I think it would be good to put this a little bit into perspective. I choose my words carefully because there's a lot of strength in this type of research, but there's also a lot of important weaknesses. And to understand also the wider implications of what we are finding and also the political implications of what we're finding, I think it's good that we take into consideration the weaknesses here. So there are a number of general criticisms of these type of data that are important. They're important for this entire line of research, but also for research on, let's say, non-immigrant children. I won't delve into that here because I think it's good to pause a little bit and think about the implications for using these type of data when studying immigrant children. And the one obvious comment that I think people have is that this also seems to pick up language issues. Immigrant children, so these tests are by definition made in the dominant languages in destination countries, in which by definition, almost by definition, immigrant children might be less proficient. So that seems to be part of the explanation why immigrant children score lower, although we can partly also with these data control for these differences. Now, I would also say that maybe this is not a completely fair critique, because and this harks back to what PISA actually tries to do, and PIRLS and TIMSS actually try to do. They try to measure proficiency and skills, not necessarily for the sake of testing this proficiency, but in an attempt to assess the ability to use these skills to quote unquote participate in society. And that means that these proficiency differences might help us to understand problems later on, even if the differences that we do observe are partly driven by language differences. It's still fair though. There is another problem with designs like these, and these are data-related issues that we then have to struggle with. So for example, you can, by definition, only use a very low number of destination countries. And this has to do, for example, with the fact that the destination countries, different countries, measure immigration differently. So they, for example, ask different questions about origin countries. And if we don't know where, if you want to study origin differences and you don't know exactly from which origin country someone comes, then you cannot really analyze this country. So while PISA has 72 countries now, not all the countries are useful in analyses like these. And the fewer countries you compare, the more important it becomes to, or the more relevant it becomes to specify your models correctly, but also the harder that becomes, because your degrees of freedom issues and you cannot control for everything. So that is one of the issues that plagues this type of research. You cannot be sure that what you are interpreting as an effect of an institutional characteristic is not actually caused by a third variable that you do not have in your model. And that is a fundamental weakness to this type of research. And the second fundamental flaw is, I think, and it's always nice if one gets to burn his own research, right? That there are, that the number of origin groups that we can analyze are also very selected because of selective migration, and they're also very few, and they're also very small. And they are certainly not based on random samples of origin groups and destination countries, whereas we do try to infer from this and act as if the origin groups that we have in our data are actually representative of all the origin groups of all the people in these origin countries. And that is a very debatable issue. That makes making inferences very hard. And it also makes that we have to, as researchers, have to be very cautious in the way we interpret all of this. And then there's also the interpretation of the origin difference that I didn't see that one coming when we started this research line. But people also equate origin countries with ethnicity, and then it becomes a bit weird. If we are starting to talk about differences between ethnic groups in their mathematical performance, and I will share with you in a second why this will become weird. Then this whole type of research gets a completely different framing, so to speak. Okay, what can we, I think, Melissa, I'm very much still in time, right? Yes, good. Maybe some general conclusions then that we can draw from this before we delve into how this research is used outside of academia. First and foremost, what we might conclude from this is that contexts do seem to matter. So from the research that we evaluate, we can see that educational tracking is very likely related to achievement differential. This is also very consistent with research that we do on children with non-immigrant backgrounds. And we see that also being relevant for children with an immigration background. And then there are many papers now that very strongly and increasingly strongly suggest, and people are also trying all sorts of quasi-experimental causal designs to make this claim, that comprehensive systems actually give room for immigrant children to catch up with natives, whereas non-comprehensive education systems make these inequalities wider. And then there's also this one paper that suggests that if you ability track on subject, that then positively influences the achievement of immigrant pupils. So this is still very much a moving field, but these are the general conclusion that I would feel safe drawing from this literature. What we can also say is that they do matter, but that they certainly do not seem to matter much. Origin and destination countries, from all the analysis that I've seen, they have explanatory power, but it's very, very limited. Sometimes studies suggest that origin countries are a little bit more important than destination countries. Other countries suggest that destination countries are a little bit more important than origin countries. And that whole discussion that seems to pick up, that seems to be important, but it really isn't, because what we overwhelmingly find is that the overall contribution of both the origin and destination countries to explaining variance in this performance of immigrant children is very limited. And I will show you one of my favorite pie charts to make this point. So this is the proportion of explained variance, explained observed variance of immigration of children with immigrant background and reading ability. Sorry. And what you see here is that destination countries explain about 7% of all the observed variance. That origin countries explain about 4%. That the combination explains about 3%, and that 86% is explained by individual level characteristics. So there is a lot of talk about destination country characteristics and whether or not we can actually help immigrants achieve through designing education systems better, or by designing schools differently, or whatnot. What we see here, or at the same way, there is discussion about should we select based on origin or not. What this pie chart seems to suggest is that by far the most important explanations take place at the individual level. So it's much more about composition than it is about context. Now, why is this important? And I think this is the time where we can discuss a little bit the meta consequences of this line of research. I'm sure you are aware how important PISA has become in policy discussions about education. PISA is actually designed to assess how countries' education systems succeed in training elementary skills. That was from the get-go the goal of this type of research and of this type of data collection. And what the OECD does is rank countries based on pupils' average scores on these tests, and does it every 3 years. And these things, as we in university take the university ranking, we always say it's not important, but we look at it still, and then we are very happy if we move up a notch or two. These PISA rankings are also very important for policymakers and politicians. And if countries perform less well than they expected they would, that can actually lead to a PISA shock. The most important one happening in Germany in the early 2000s. Low scores on PISA generally means that something, for policymakers at least, means that something has to change, and then policies are made to change this. Now, these data also allow for ranking countries' immigrant native achievement gaps, as I just did. And it is very tempting to interpret then this achievement gap as evidence for the extent to which governments are successful in having immigrant children integrate in their societies. But I think that we should be very cautious with this type of interpretation. And this is because of exactly of the pie chart that I just showed, by far, most of the differences are caused by individual level differences, and only a very modest proportion of the total variation in achievement gaps is actually linked or can actually be explained by destination country differences. So by ranking these countries and saying Germany is performing better than the Netherlands in this regard, you're a bit cheating because you have a completely different type of population. Still, we do it. And also, relatively low PISA scores from immigrant children can actually, from various origin countries, can actually lead politicians to argue that we might not want to have immigrant children from these countries. Thilo Sarrazin in 2010 famously did so in his Deutschland schafft sich ab book. Again, looking at the pie chart that I just shown, this seems like a very, very harsh and very rudimentary claim to make, and not very nuanced. And I think when we started this research, I wasn't really sure what the role of this type of research would be, and also what my contribution could be. And I'm getting increasingly convinced that what we should try and do is we try to provide the public debate with the type of information that is needed to make these claims. And then you can say to Thilo Sarrazin, okay, you might think this, but you should really look at the individual differences and not at origin differences. Definitely, these national league tables should not be interpreted as indications of success for successful or failing integration. I would argue that this whole issue should be regarded in its full complexity, and that these snapshot scores are at best interpreted as a result of long-term sequences in which both the performance of immigrant children and native children play a role, and that we have to understand them within the specific context of their origin and destination countries. I've been making this argument for a number of years now, but of course, that really doesn't help. If people pick up the math and they pick up the tables, they can use it to serve their own purposes. And the best example here is still Thilo Sarrazin, because in this book he actually quotes a table from one of these papers and says, look, it should probably be a good idea to stop having people from Islamic backgrounds entering into Germany because they perform so badly on PISA. That's one of the tables from one of my papers, and that then gets a complete own. It starts leading its own life. All right, I think that was it for what I wanted to share, Melissa. Do we have ample time for questions?
Yes, we
do.
do.
I would invite questions.
Thank you so much for that, Mark. I think that gave us a lot of food for thought, and I hope that it will stimulate the discussion quite a bit. So perhaps a first question is, within your talk now, you showed a lot of nuances, a lot of difficulties with the data that's being used. But what is a policymaker to do with this, right? So policymakers don't want to hear, well, it depends, or, well, this caveat, this caveat, this caveat. If you were now to give the Dutch government really specific, or Dutch government or any other government, very specific policy advice about how immigrant children could reach their best potential here in the Netherlands or in another country, what is the clear soundbite for a policymaker?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think my answer would be that we should resist the temptation to talk, and it's a very generic answer, I'm sorry, but I really feel like this. We should resist the temptation to talk in sound bites to policymakers. Based on the research that I've presented here, I've been invited to The Hague once or twice to talk about it. And at the Ministry of Education, both with my co-author, Jaap Dronkers, and we were invited there to present the work that explored the relevance of ethnic diversity in schools and at the national level for educational outcomes. That was a hugely controversial topic at the time, and I think to some extent it still is. Now, I'm sorry, I'm distracted. Just for a second, I'm going to ask something. Yeah, I'm back. So what we tried to do there, and they were also looking for sound bites and for clear and short answers. What we try to do there is nuance this entire debate. Indeed, by saying, yes, ethnic diversity matters, but it doesn't really matter that much. And to be honest, a lot of the explanations fall outside of the realm of policy, if you, at least of integration policy. Immigration policy might be a different thing. And you could infer from this entire research line that you should select, if you want, you want the immigrant native gap to be smaller, then you should select immigrants at the gate and say, yes, you have a PhD, or yes, you have a master's degree, so you have so many points more than this person, and you're that more likely to get a permit to work here and stay here. But that is, I think, also the answer to a different question, right? And I think it is our responsibility to make the nuance, to bring the nuance into this debate.
Yeah, thanks. And it is quite clear that, you know, a lot of what matters is maybe not what the policymakers are doing. However, I guess there is still a bit of what's going on, and I'm just wondering if there are any really good cases or best practices of even for that small bit where you can do something that we can learn from. Or there are certain countries or even certain regions or local areas that seem to be getting it right.
Your question is, are there examples of best practices in countries that seem to be getting it right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what this may be good to I didn't talk about that in my talk, but what this research does is try to get away from just comparing country cases and try to move towards the variables underlying the differences. So it's not about comparing Germany to the Netherlands, but it's about comparing the education systems in various countries. For sure, immigrant children are performing better in traditional immigration countries, and it has something to do, as I just mentioned, with their selective immigration policies. And also, for sure, countries with comprehensive school systems seem to be beneficial to immigrant children. So that is something that I would feel comfortable saying. Yeah.
Thanks. We have another question coming in here from those who are watching. So the first one here says, with the rise in the popularity of far-right parties, do you believe that the disparities will widen or diminish in the future? Considering that they might have more representation in parliaments and perhaps might hamper the diminishing of the gap through policy and law wherever that might be possible. So I guess, yeah, the question is, will politics here, or do you think politics will be playing a role in the future, and in what way?
Yeah, so based on the research, I would assume that politics or political parties have a very limited influence on all of this. But there is something like a willing context of reception, where you feel, so sense of belonging at school is important for school success. And children who do not feel like they belong at school are less likely to perform well. And one can imagine that in a country where the political atmosphere changes more towards the general notion that immigrants should not be here, that would have a cultural effect on immigrant children, and that indeed would lead to their lower performance. But we don't know. That seems to me a very fair hypothesis, and it's also something that we can test. But from the analysis that have been done up until now on the role of context of reception in the political parties, and the role of political parties in that, I would not expect a very large effect. No.
And then
nice question.
Then there's also the question about the flip side. So do you think with the current political climate in several countries, will the kind of negative achievement of some groups be used to perhaps make exceptions for, or to, do you think this will be used basically to try to turn public opinion also against these types of immigrants and letting them in the future?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
So one part was, the first side of this question was, do you think that with the changing way that political parties are perhaps moving, or perhaps the far right, if there would be issues there with policy making the achievement gap worse? But and then the next question is the flip side. So do you see some maybe populist parties using the achievement gap as kind of ammunition against immigrants? And are you concerned that that will increase in the future?
Yeah, for sure. So, and they have. So Tilo Zarazan's book is a good example of this. When we started this whole line of research, I was still a bachelor student when I started this line of research. As an intern at the European University Institute, and I distinctly remember calling my wife, my then girlfriend, now my wife, and discussing with her, should I actually do this? Because, you know, this is also the type of research, it's exciting, but it's also a bit dangerous, right? And you might find something that you are politically not necessarily, that's not necessarily in line with your political views. And we had a long discussion about this. My wife said, well, if you want to be a scientist, man, and this is the moment where you have to say, okay, I'm going to do the analysis. And she was, of course, right. I did. But what I feared back then was indeed what you're now describing. I have no problem saying that. And it had happened. It has happened. So this is exactly the type of consequences that you now describe, we saw. So the fact that this table was published in this book, and that based on this one, not just based on this one table, but that this table was used in a line of reasoning that said we should stop as much as possible immigrants from Muslim countries to enter enter Germany. Yeah, that was not necessarily something that I would have. Yeah, that's not something that you want. But on the other hand, yeah, people are free to interpret the research the way they see fit, and that also gives you the opportunity to bring nuance to the debate and say, no, well, you can interpret it like this, but you should look at the fact that it's only that the explanation is only very moderately at the level of origin countries. So yeah, so yes, I do fear it because it has happened.
So then, given what you know, given all the research that's been done, where is the future of this research area? What hasn't been looked into that we still need to know?
Yeah, so I think what this whole line of research can really benefit from, and it's also something that we try to do now in various projects, is try to figure out how we can actually get closer to answering the actual causal question of the implications of institutions for immigrant children's performance. This is what I just said. You compare a large number of countries, but it's by definition a limited set of countries. And you can never exclude the possibility that there is a third factor that you haven't put in your models that will explain what you're interpreting as causal much better than what you have put in your model. So when we started this line of research, this whole credibility revolution that we're seeing now hadn't really started yet. That has kicked off. Now we have much wider set of tools and instruments to our disposal that we can use to actually get closer to the causal inferences that we need to make if we want to make claims like the education system affects outcomes in this and this and this way. So this is where I think we should take this, and we are also taking it into this direction. Not just us, but generally the field is also moving in that direction strongly. And I think that's a very good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think this was a really interesting discussion, and I think has given the audience a lot of food for thought, and will hopefully also make us all go forward in a different way when we're reading research, when we're thinking about policy, and when we're also looking at and considering outcomes of immigrant children. I think we'll leave it here for now. And I very much want to thank you for being with us and sharing your knowledge and insights with us on behalf of the Refugee Project Maastricht, the Maastricht Young Academy, the Maastricht Center for Citizenship, Migration and Development, the UN Student Association, and UNU Merit. Once again, thank you for taking time out of your day and your night, actually, and having to do these, of course, under more difficult circumstances now in the current situation that we're in, with us all working from home. So thank you again for being with us, and we hope to see you again soon in the future.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me, and thank you for listening to me.
Okay. Bye,
Thank you all for
everyone.
your questions. Okay. Bye-bye.